So that's basically a graph showing where all the English translations come from. We focused on a lot of the differences, but you should bear in mind that even in the earliest times, the translations in the 17th century right up to the 21st century, if you compare a King James and an ESV, the differences compile to less than 2%. Okay, it's about 1.85% difference. So the overwhelming time, the texts are in incredible agreement, which is interesting when you think about it, because that shows really the fidelity of the scribal transmission of the text of the New Testament. Because the King James Bible, when it was compiled, these are the manuscripts that it worked off of, none dating earlier than 1000 AD. And so you'd kind of think, well, what happened in all that time, dating from the 1st century up to the year 1000, was, the copying process. Did mistakes get multiplied and multiplied? Certainly there were mistakes, but the vast majority of the text remained unchanged. And when you compare something like ESV, that avails of manuscripts, a lot more manuscripts, and a lot earlier manuscripts, it definitely shows the strength of the textual basis of the modern translation, but also it shows basically essentially the fidelity of that whole process. You're dealing with less than 2%. Of all the textual variation, there's no single doctrine that hinges on a textual variation that we should, is a dated Christ hanging on a textual variation. You do have some verses like 1 Timothy 3:16 that have textual variation talking about the dated Christ, but you also have others that are unanimous in any of the manuscripts, like John 1:1. And so it's important to keep it in perspective, The wealth of, these are only a fraction of the manuscripts available for biblical translators. There's over 5,000 manuscripts available for the New Testament alone in Greek. So translators really have a wealth of information. When you consider and compare that to other works that were produced around the same time as the New Testament, some of the classical histories, writings like from Livy, writings from Caesar, these texts that you can buy from, Angland edition, any of the classical histories, what they're based off is usually 1 or 2 manuscripts, and the date is usually about 1,000 years. Like if you're dealing with Caesar's Gallic War, you're dealing with nearly 1,000 years and you're working off 2 manuscripts and they're not even complete. Yet historians place an awful lot of faith on Caesar's account of the Germanic War. It's the only account we have of the Germanic War, and it's still taught in history today, even though its textual basis is pitiful compared to the wealth of the New Testament. The New Testament and the Bible in general is unsurpassed in its textual fidelity due to the manuscripts available, due to the time lag. I mean, if the New Testament was compiled at the end of the 1st century, you already have all these manuscripts available at the beginning of the 2nd century. So the time gap between the date of composition and our earliest manuscripts is so tiny, as well as the wealth of manuscripts available, that we should have definitely great confidence in that. So basically the big difference really between English versions today, between like an English ESV and a King James, comes down to really the textual basis for them. The Textus Receptus reflects a text that comes from about 1,000 years after the time of the New Testament was written. It definitely has a lot less support. There are some times where the TR still preserves readings that have no manuscript support. And then you have the modern Greek New Testaments, like the Nestle Allen text, that avail of a lot more textual evidence. But still, it's important to bear in mind that the King James Bible and the ESV don't present 2 different Gospels. I mean, it's a Bible that churches can use either or. I grew up using the King James Bible all my life, and I didn't come away, thinking that the Trinity consisted of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph or something. It's important to bear in mind that textual variation, although it does exist, is very, very small. Modern texts avail of much more ancient and more manuscripts. If you look at the philosophy, apart from the underlying text, English Bibles kind of have a different textual or translation philosophy. Like the Message would be a paraphrase. It's not really a translation technically, it's more of a paraphrase, it's thought for thought. Dynamic equivalence will be slightly less, in the paraphrase. It would try to translate the thought behind the word. It's a thought for thought translation. And formal equivalents like King James and ESV would try to be as literal as possible. None of these translations are word for word, because that would just render it impossible to read. It wouldn't make any sense. But they try to be as literal as possible. And so if you are wondering, the differences sometimes don't have anything to do with the textual basis. Sometimes they do have to do with the translation employed. It could be less literal in some translations. What would I recommend? I'd recommend as many as possible. Augustine said that a plurality of manuscripts and versions can help us in our understanding. And that was a quote that the King James Bible preface took in its preface, encouraging Christians to compare and contrast translations. And so it definitely would be something that we should be keen to do, is to definitely have different translations and compare them, and that would definitely aid us in our study. And as this year begins, I would definitely encourage all of us to seriously, again, thank God that we do have access, such free access to the English Bible. Unparalleled. We have access to a purer text than English-speaking Christians have ever had. And that's something that's amazing, and something that we should be incredibly thankful for. And when the Anglo-Saxons arrived in Britain, back in the 5th century, we now have a purer text. We have access to better manuscripts. We have access to better resources than any English-speaking Christians have ever had. And that's by God's grace, and that's something we need to be thankful for, absolutely. Just to wrap up, like, if you are interested in pursuing like some reading further, there's a couple of books I definitely recommend. This one is really helpful. It's by a textual critic by Philip Comfort. It's New Testament Text and Translation Commentary. You don't have to know Greek to read this commentary. He translates everything for you. Basically, he goes through all the major English translations of the New Testament, and he points out every single verse that reads differently in any of the translations, and he explains why it's different. He explains the textual basis for it, the translation behind it, and it's extremely helpful just to understand, those questions we have. Well, why is that verse not in this translation or something? So I definitely recommend that. It's a very scholarly book. It's really accessible. You don't have to know Greek at all to read that. It's very, very accessible. It's by Philip Comfort, who is a very well-respected textual critic. If you are interested in the Old Testament, another highly respected scholar of the Hebrew Bible, Walter Kaiser, he produced the book, The Old Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? And he looks at basically two things. He looks at the archaeology and history of the Old Testament. He also looks at the text of the Old Testament, looking at the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, Dead Sea Scrolls. And his conclusion is you absolutely can trust it because it's unparalleled, it's fidelity. Again, it's a really accessible book. Some of the other ones would be a bit more nitty-gritty. This is probably the best introduction on the market to text of the New Testament, Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman. It's the 4th edition. It's really helpful just to give a really in-depth background to the production of the New Testament, its translation, its history, the different text types, and definitely a nitty-gritty one for the Old Testament, Manual 12, Textual Criticism and Hebrew Bible. He goes through the origins of the Old Testament, its transmission, the different scribal habits, the different basically schools of manuscript production in the Old Testament. He looks at the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's a very, very well-respected textual critic, probably the leading scholar on the Dead Sea Scrolls. So those are some books that will definitely give you a really good basis. If you've got questions, maybe your friends or people are maybe kind of criticizing the Bible, or maybe saying, no, you can't trust it, and kind of maybe putting doubts, this is a really helpful book. It's called Reinventing Jesus. It's not just to do with the text of the New Testament. It also deals with Christ, the deity of Christ, the Christology of Jesus in the New Testament. It also deals with the textual transmission of the New Testament. It's very readable, and it's really interesting, and it definitely gives a solid grounding for our confidence in the New Testament. So that's it. If there's any questions, go for it. That's basically our quick overview.